As we were driving to Oskaloosa yesterday to meet up with some of our family to celebrate Bethany's birthday, we listened to, Becca's birthday. We listened to the Gospel of Matthew on the way there, and like the first 16 chapters of the book of Acts on the way back. And what was really interesting was, as we were going through, you're thinking about things that other Gospels talk about that were actually not there in Matthew. So, for example, like when you get to Jesus coming to Jerusalem for the last time, some of the other Gospels talk about the raising Lazarus from the dead. That's not found in the book of Matthew. And it seems like such a big pivotal thing. It's interesting that Matthew didn't mention it in his gospel. But so it was really good. And this morning, I'd like to actually go to Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 36, and read from the New International Version the text that we'll be using for our message this morning. It says this: "Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid.' 'Lord, if it is you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come to you on the water.' 'Come,' he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why do you doubt?' And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" This morning, I'd like to look at this passage and point out three things that we can learn from Peter's stroll on the water. The first is this: that we can do great things with God. That we can do great things with God. This we can see in verse 29 where it says this: "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got out of the boat, he walked on the water, and he came toward Jesus. Peter was able to walk on water with Jesus' help. As the disciples are in the boat, a storm began to rage. So, much of Jesus' ministry happened in the area of Galilee, mostly on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus and the disciples have gotten into a boat, and they've gone over to the ministers on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. They get into the boat. They go over across to the east side of Galilee in the area of the Decapolis. And the people have actually come around the sea to him, kind of chased him around the sea. And Jesus has sent the disciples on ahead in the boat to go back over to the west side of Galilee where he normally kind of ministers. And Jesus has gone off up into the mountains to pray. in the Sea of Galilee, it's not that big. It's good, clean, fresh water. Out of the Sea of Galilee, you get the Jordan River that comes on down, and then it empties into the Dead Sea. And to the north of the Sea of Galilee, there is kind of this mountainous range, this range of mountains. And because of the way that the topography is, these storms can quickly blow out of the mountains and out across the Sea of Galilee with very little warning. I remember one of my professors that had actually been to Israel had said that there were actually signs that were posted around the Sea of Galilee that warned tourists of how quickly these storms could come up. And so, as the disciples are going back across, they've gotten caught into one of these storms. Jesus looks up from praying, and he sees the boat, and he sees the waves that are out on the sea. And at this point, Jesus goes out to them on the water. The disciples are at first alarmed, but Jesus spoke to them and calmed their fears. And I can picture Peter as he sees his Lord and the things that started to go through his mind. Perhaps Peter thought, wow, that is really cool that he's walking on the water. I'd like to do that. Then Peter asked Jesus if he can join him, and Jesus says, come on. And so I can picture Peter in my mind as he places one foot over the side of the boat and kind of checks it out there, and his foot doesn't sink. And so he sticks his other foot over the edge, and he begins to walk on top of the water. And as his courage rises, he begins to walk toward Jesus. Peter, with Jesus' help, was able to accomplish something that no one else other than Christ himself has ever been able to do. Peter walked on water. Now, I can walk on water as long as I can choose the form. If it's ice, I'm good to go, right? But Peter actually walked on water in its liquid form. In the same way, I think that we can do great things with Christ's help. We look at the world around us and we want to throw up our hands in despair. But I firmly believe that if we seek to serve Jesus and seek his aid, that we can do some extraordinary things for him and his kingdom. You know, as we were coming home and we were listening to the book of Acts, we listened to Stephen's sermon that he preached right before he was stoned. He was one of the first deacons in the church. And it's in Stephen's sermon that we learned that Moses' life breaks up into 3 40-year periods. He spent the first 40 years of his life with on-the-job training in Egypt, being raised with the same education, the same training as one of Pharaoh's sons would have received. He spends the next 40 years in Midian, herding sheep, learning how to lead sheep in the wilderness. It wasn't until Moses was 80 years old that God appeared to him in the burning bush and said, I want you to lead my people out of Egypt. If God could use Moses when he's 80, He can use the rest of us as well. You're not too old for God to do great things with you. Maybe God's got another 40 years planned for Dale. We can do extraordinary things if we are willing to seek Him and to serve Him. Peter was at a place where he trusted Jesus. Jesus said that he would be able to join him, and so Peter wanted to do that. Many times we see complete and absolute faith in little children with their parents. When a dad tosses his child up into the air and catches them, and the child never ever stops to think that dad might drop him, because he trusts his dad, that his dad's going to always be there to catch him. I remember when Becca was really little and we had the purple Dodge pickup, and we had pulled into the driveway and we were unloading stuff out of the truck, and I had turned around and Becca just leapt out of the truck expecting me to catch her, except I didn't realize she was going to do it. And she fell and had to get stitches, right? She just believed that Dad was just going to be there to catch her, even though Dad didn't know she was getting ready to jump, right? She had that trust and she had that faith. And sometimes, our kids do that. Perhaps we need to have that same kind of faith or trust in our spiritual father and in Jesus. A faith that says, no matter what happens, I know that you're in control and that everything is going to be okay. Peter was able to walk on water because he trusted Jesus. We also can do great things for God's kingdom if we trust Christ. That may be hard to do, but we need to do it. Just this last week, there's been a couple of different sources. Was it, Mel, is it Ashbury, Kentucky? Anybody seen on the news where they've talked about the Ashbury revival that's going on? One person, a couple of people. It's an amazing story, actually. They have chapel services at the university. And one young man got up and he started confessing his sins. And they said that suddenly in the chapel, the presence of God was so powerful that people were moved. And as a result of that, that was on February the 8th, there have been continual worship services there that have gone on since February the 8th. Students have dragged their mattresses into the chapel to continue to be there because of what God is doing in Ashbury, Kentucky. And it started with one young man that got up and shared his weaknesses and his failings with the rest of the student body that was there. God can do great things if we're willing to be used. I thought it was amazing that Tucker Carlson on Fox News heard about what was going on in Ashbury, Kentucky, and he wanted to take a film crew down there because he was so impressed and moved by what was going on there. And they called Fox News back and they said, please don't come. Because God is doing an amazing thing here and we don't want to get in the way of it. And so they respectfully asked that Fox News just allow God to do what He's doing without their interference. I think that's an amazing thing. A second thing that we need to do is we need to keep our focus in the right place. And we can see this in verse 30. It says this, "But when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me.'" When Peter began to walk on the water, he had his eyes on Jesus. The Bible says that when Peter got out of the boat, he started walking toward Jesus. His eyes, his mind, his attention was focused on Jesus. But when he let his attention go to the wind and the waves, Peter got into trouble. I think that a lot of the time, the same thing happens to us as well. We start out with our eyes focused on Jesus and what is really important. But then we get concerned with other issues around us. We must keep our focus or we'll get sidetracked along the way. We may decide that we're going to start reading the Bible or we're going to start inviting people to church. But then during the week, we're able to come up with all kinds of reasons why we can't find time to get it done. It's like we're trying to put out a forest fire, but we keep seeming to get sidetracked by brush fires along the way, to the point that we never actually make it to the seat of the fire, to the actual source of the fire. If we truly wish to be pleasing to God and to do extraordinary things for His kingdom, we've got to keep our eyes focused on Him. I know you never think of it to look at me today, but I used to be a good runner. I used to be thin a long time ago. And I remember watching this movie. And in the movie, they had these runners. And the person that was in the lead kept looking over their shoulder to see how far the runners were behind them. And it really, really bugged me. Because when I was in track, they told us, don't ever do that, for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it shows the person behind you that you're worried about them. And it might just give them the encouragement that they need to pass you, right? But the other reason that they said don't ever turn over your shoulder to look back behind you is because in doing so, you might break your stride. Instead, we were taught to keep our attention, our focus on the finish line. So if you're running a long race, you'd sprint for position and then you'd pace yourself at a good fast pace that you could keep for a long time until you got close to the end of the race and you would start sprinting as hard and fast as you could go, and hopefully you timed it so that when you got to the finish line, all of your energy was gone and you didn't leave anything left on the track. Can you imagine what it would be like if you're running the 2 mile and you start sprinting as soon as the gun goes off and you try to hold that pace for the entire race? You'd have to be in really good shape to make that happen, wouldn't you? You keep as your focus the finish line, and everything that you do has as its goal the finish line and finishing well. That should apply to us too. That we keep our eyes on Jesus and we don't get distracted by all of the things that are going on around us. Because we'll find that we never really get to the important things if we're only dealing with the urgent ones. And then thirdly, doubt can destroy our efforts. Doubt can destroy our efforts. Let's go back to Matthew 14, verses 30 through 33. It says this, "But when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why did you doubt?'" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When Peter began to look at the wind and the waves, the Bible says that he began to doubt. You know, a lot of times we give Peter a bad rap here because he doubted and he started to sink. But you know, the other 11 guys are still back in the boat. The other 11 never even had the courage to step out of the boat and onto the water. So yes, Peter struggled and Peter failed, but at least Peter tried. What is that old saying? Better to have tried and failed than never to have tried at all. I can picture in my mind's eye Peter as he began to look around. Perhaps he began to think, this is crazy. Look at the wind and the waves. People don't walk on water. Glub, 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 right? Peter had taken his eyes off Jesus and he began to doubt. And when he began to doubt, he started to sink. We need to realize that just as doubt caused Peter to sink in the water, so also our own doubt and discouragement can cause us to fail. You know, we just went through that sermon series on James, and if you read the book like I asked you to, then this passage of Scripture should be pretty familiar to you. In James 1, 6 through 8, it says, "But when he asks," and James here is talking specifically about praying and asking for wisdom. But he says, but when he asks, he must believe and what? Not doubt. Because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. You know, I know in the past we've talked about biblical principles that as we look at our world around us, we live in a world that is ordered. It's ordered in such a way that we actually have what we call laws of nature, right? The laws, the first and second law of thermodynamics, the law of gravity, right? We have laws by which our world is governed. We don't just wake up in the morning and find ourselves floating on the ceiling, right? Because our world is ordered and structured in such a way that it makes sense, right? Now, what we do in the world sometimes doesn't make sense, but God created our world in such a way that it has structure and that it has order. If God created our world that way, isn't it reasonable to assume that the spiritual world that we can't see has laws that govern it as well? Do you remember when Jesus, in the New Testament, goes to Nazareth? And it says there, he did not do many miracles there. Do you remember why? Because of their lack of faith. They didn't believe. As we were listening through Matthew, there was like 2 or 3 different instances where Jesus is surprised by the faith of the people that come to him. One was a Samaritan woman who was looking for healing for her children. And Jesus says to her, I was sent to the children of Israel. You know, and it's not right to to throw the food for the children to the dogs. And the lady's response is, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table. And because of her great faith, Jesus granted her request. Another one was the woman, remember, who had the bloody discharge, who had been bleeding for years and years, and the doctors hadn't been able to solve it. And Jesus is going through the crowd, and she has so much faith that she says, I know that even if I just touch his garment, that I'll be healed. And as Jesus is walking by, she, surreptitiously reaches out and touches his garment. And Jesus stops. And he says, I felt the power go out of me. Because of her great faith. Not because of what Jesus, consciously did. She was healed. And the third one that came up in that passage that we listened to in the car was the centurion who came to Jesus and said, I have a servant who is sick. Would you come and heal them? And Jesus says, okay, let's go. And he says, no, you don't need to come. He said, I'm a man with men who are underneath me. And I tell them to come and to go or to do things, and they do them. I know that if you say the word, you don't have to come, but if you just say the word, that my servant will be healed. And Matthew says that Jesus was amazed. And he said, truly I say to you, I have not seen such great faith in all of Israel. Go, and it will be just as you said. And at that moment, his servant was healed. All three of those stories that come from the book of Matthew have something in common. That those people had great faith. And they didn't doubt. Because I believe that there's a biblical principle that's there. That our faith and our belief allows God to move. Can God move on his own? Absolutely, he can. If you have a chessboard, well, let's make it even simpler. You have a checkerboard, right? What physically prevents you from picking up your checker and setting it in the back row to be kinged? Nothing, except the rules, right? Physically, you can pick that checker up and you can set it in the back of the row, but the rules say that checker can only move in certain ways. Does it mean that you can't pick that checker up physically and do it? No. But if you're going to play the game by the rules, you have to follow the rules. God has established certain rules by which this process of people choosing who they will serve is going to be played out. God will not force you to choose him, and God will not allow Satan to do it either. There are rules that have to be followed. You can't just say, well, I want to go to heaven, and that's it, right? It's like picking up your checker and sticking it in the king row. God says, if you want to get to heaven, you have to do it through my son. You have to accept the sacrifice that he paid for your sins. There's no other way. And I think that this idea of faith is part of those principles by which the supernatural world is governed. And it's by our faith that we allow God to move. with God's help, I strongly believe that each and every one of us is capable of doing great things. We may even plan or begin to do something great when somebody comes along and says, well, that'll never work. Or, how about this one? We've never done that here before. Ever hear that? Then we begin to think, well, maybe they're right. It probably would never work. And we get discouraged and give up. If we doubt, we will never get anything accomplished. I'm sure that there was more than one person that told Gideon in the Old Testament that he could never defeat the Midianite people with 300 soldiers. In fact, they probably said something like, are you crazy? Right? If Gideon would have said, I think they're probably right, I can't do it. I'll only get killed. Israel would have never defeated the Midianites. God can use you to do wonderful things in His kingdom, but only if you believe in Him and don't doubt. We can do extraordinary things for Jesus and His kingdom, but we must keep our focus on Him and not doubt or get discouraged. This morning, I want to encourage you to make a difference with your life for Jesus. It's never too late to do great things for Him, to trust Him and to allow Him to do extraordinary things in and through you.